All right, let's tie a rusty spinner. This is a great pattern to use in the evening on so many of our Colorado rivers. The Frying Pan, the Roaring Fork, the Colorado, the Eagle, all of them that have got mayflies in them generally have some sort of spinner fall in the evening. And this is a rusty version, which is just a rusty brown variation. And of course you can tie it in whatever color you like. You can tie it in rusty or pale yellow, pale olive, black for a trico, in those little tiny sizes for tricos. Really the same fly, just small variations on the theme. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with some, this is some old Lagerton 74 denier rusty brown thread, just because that's what I had handy in this little bag. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start this thread at about 75 or 80% point. An 8/0 thread or 14/0 Veevus will work fine here. So I'm going to start that thread at about the 80% point. I'm going to wrap back so that the thread is hanging even with the start of the barb there. And this is where I'm going to put the tail in. And I'm going to do a 3-fiber split tail, so I'm going to show you a little trick to do this. I'm going to take 3 microfibrils. And one of the things that spinners have, as opposed to just adult mayflies or sub-adult mayflies as the case may be, is the tail's a bit longer. So I'm going to make the tail about 1.5 shanks. Now in a lot of cases their tails are very, very long, but if you make the tail way, way long, these tails don't collapse when a fish eats it the way a real natural bug's tails do. So it can actually push the fly out of the fish's mouth. So I want to make sure that I've kind of elongated that tail, but not made it so long that it's going to impede my hooking. So I'm going to measure that, 1.5 hook shanks or so. And I'm going to catch this at the bend with 2 or 3 turns of thread so that those fibers are square up on top of the hook. I'm going to bump my thread one more turn forward here. Now I'm going to take my thumbnail and press it up underneath those 3 tails to get them separated. I'm going to pull the near tail toward me and the far tail away from me. And depending on what kind of mayfly you're imitating, some of them have only 2 tails, in which case you can go consult the RS2 and that'll show you how to do a 2-fiber split tail, but I want to show you how to do all 3 in this case. So there we've got 3 fibers and I've just kind of separated them with my fingers. Now, you could leave them that way, but they'll go back together. So what we want to do is we want to make a figure 8 wrap of thread between these. And what I'm going to do, as you can see, my thread is up here by the hook point now. I'm going to take my thread down under the near tail and up between it and the middle tail and take a thread wrap down around the hook. Then I'm going to come up and I sort of let off the tension here and I'm going to come on top of the middle tail and under the far tail. So let me turn this a bit. You can follow that path of that thread. It's a figure 8. And then start to tighten that up. And we end up with this nicely spread 3-fiber tail. Alright, so once we've got that on there, it's easy as that. That takes a lot of practice. Don't feel bad if you don't get it on your first or 27th try. It takes some practice to do. Thread control is everything there. That makes a big difference in how it works out. But that big widespread tail will really help support the back end of that fly. You can see how those are nicely spread evenly out the back of the fly. So now I'm going to come forward over those butt ends up to about where I started the thread, and I'll trim those 3 stubs out. And then I'll come back. I want to flatten this thread a bit. I'm going to come back to the bend. And to be perfectly honest with you, in bigger sizes I'll use a biot abdomen. But if I get down in tiny, tiny sizes, trico spinners, I just use thread. And you can see that thread makes a very nice, smooth, little thin body. Spinners in general are very thin. Tricos are actually a little on the fat side, but I don't want to say anything about their genetics. They're built like I am. They're a little short and stocky. But what I'm going to do here for this size 16 spinner is I'm going to take, this is a rusty brown goose biot. This is a natural Canada goose biot, so it's going to have a dark edge. And I'm going to tie this in by its tip, but you can see how far forward that tip is extending, almost to the end of the abdomen. And I'm going to catch it and come forward over that tip end. And at this point I'm going to come in with a little bit of zap-a-gap. This feather is tied in notched down. I'm going to make a smooth body I could go on and on about the correct way to tie in a biot, but the easiest answer is tie it in and make one turn. If the leading edge is standing up, you're in good shape. If the leading edge is following, take the feather out, turn it over, and tie it back in and wrap it against the curve. You can wrap it either way. It doesn't come out exactly the same, but it's close enough. So I'm going to take this biot. I just put a little zappy gap on the hook there, and I'm going to start to wrap this biot. And you can see that leading edge, or that stand-up edge, is leading the way. So I'm going to cover that stand-up edge with the next turn. And in the case of these spinners, I want to try to keep the body fairly skinny. So I'm making nice long angled travel wraps as I work forward. And when I get up to the end of my thread underbody, I'm going to catch that biot with a couple turns of thread. Cinch everything down there good and tight, and then I can come in and trim that stub out. You can see what a pretty body that makes. It's just really nicely segmented, beautiful feather. Biots are tough to argue with. They sure look nice. Whether or not you catch any more fish on them than otherwise, I don't know. But you know, who wants to catch fish on ugly flies? Not me. All right, now I'm going to take, for the wing on this fly, I'm going to take some white McFlylon. And you can use white or dun or gray. I like white, it's just a little easier to see for me. And you know, this is a whole strand, so that's a lot. I don't need the whole strand. So I'm going to take probably a little less than a half a strand by the time I get this all sorted out. And just in front of where I tied that biot, you can see that there's some bulk there. Just in front of there, I'm going to lay that piece of McFlylon in and tie it down with 2 turns. And I've sort of laid that across the hook. I'm going to pull my near side toward me, and I'm going to come up and make 2 more wraps going the opposite angle. And you can see how those are now forming an X across the center of the wing. And I want to anchor those down with a couple more turns each way, just to anchor everything in place. Make sure they're square on the hook. And then one thing I always do to my spinners is I'm going to wrap a hackle through this. And I shouldn't say I always do this. I don't do it on all of them, but on a lot of them. I'm going to use, this is a badger hackle, so this is white with that dark center. And I wanted at least 1.5 hook gaps. It could be a little oversized. So I'm going to take this feather, and I'm going to strip the butt end. And I can pull those 2 wings together and roll them in my fingers so that they'll stick together. I'm going to bring the thread in behind the wings, and I'm going to tie this hackle feather in by the bare stem. And you can see I've got some exposed bare stem beyond my tie down there. And that feather is outside up, inside toward the hook. Now I'm going to dub my thorax. So I'm going to take, in this case, some rusty brown superfine dubbing, or mahogany brown is a good color. And fairly thin application on the thread. I like to do a thin application over a fairly long length because I'm going to be doing some maneuvers here. And I'm going to start this dubbing just at the front edge of the biot. And I'm going to come right up to the back of the wings, and then I'll separate the wings again. And I'm going to make a figure 8 around the wings, then sweep them back, and I'll dub right up to the hook eye, and then come back to start to shape that thorax. And you can see I can kind of use those last few turns of dubbing and end up back in again at the hook eye. So I didn't really build much up there. I'm trying to keep the fly relatively skinny. But now I'm going to take my hackle pliers and I'm going to palmer this badger feather forward through that thorax. So jump up onto the dubbing, and that's what that bare stem is for. I'm going to get a couple, 3 turns right up to the back edge of the wings. Separate those wings. I want the next turn right in front of the wings. And the front side of the feather is leading the way. We'll put another turn and come up just behind the hook eye and tie that feather off with a few tight turns of thread, and then trim that out. Now I'm going to just make enough of a thread head to cover those stub ends. And then I'll whip finish my thread and trim it out, like so. Now the reason I put the hackle on there is twofold. When you look at a natural spinner, his wings are fairly wide where they're attached to the body. So I want to build some width into this fly across the thorax, and that's what the hackle is going to help to do. The other thing that it's going to do is give us some profile so that we'll be able to see the fly on the water. So I'm going to lift these two wings up together, and I'm going to trim them just a touch longer than the hackle fibers, like so. Now I'm going to grab all of these hackle fibers on the bottom and trim them off flush, as smooth as I can across the bottom. And usually you'll have to go in and do a little cleanup. But that's one of the things I like most about the badger hackle, is it has a dark stem. And that dark stem doesn't show up as a big light colored stripe like a grizzly hackle would across the bottom. Our bottom profile has a nice wide wing profile. Lots of surface area across the bottom. Kind of mangled my tails up during that process there. I'll straighten those back out. We've got lots of good surface area across the front of the fly. So some profile, so we'll be able to see it a little bit easier. That's a good floating, easy to see, pretty accurate rusty spinner imitation. Now there's a million and one variations on the theme. Obviously different colors. You can skip the hackle, you could do a 2-fiber tail, etc. All sorts of ways to play with it, but that's the general gist, the full dress version with all the bells and whistles. Twist a few up, throw them in your box. If you're out in the evening where you've got fish rising into a bug you can't see, it's probably a spinner fall. That's the bugs after they have mated and laid their eggs and they're falling back on the water dead. Wings are laying flat, they're very hard to see, but the fish love them. It can be some of the most exciting fishing of the year, particularly summertime thing, but really great fun, something that nobody should pass up, and this is the fly you use to have a good time there. So tie some up, you know what to do with them now. You're on your own.
Damn.